Okay, so you're here because you want to understand some of the big conversations about America, right? And, it can be a lot to process. So we're diving into what all of you have sent us.
Diving deep to figure out what's really at the heart of it all.
Exactly.
And, you sent us so much interesting stuff, like thoughts and opinions from all different angles.
Yeah.
And well, we're here to kind of unpack that for you.
Yeah. And, one of the things you sent was this list titled Top 10 Biggest Problems with America. But
But honestly, it goes way beyond just 10 problems, right? It gets pretty complex.
totally.
And so we're going to try to navigate all these concerns and see if we can identify any recurring themes that come up and then present it all back to you in a way that, you know,
Makes sense.
yeah, exactly. And hopefully gets you thinking too.
So let's just jump right in. One of the first things that jumps out is this really strong reaction to racism in the U.S.
Yeah, it's not just pointing out racism. It's more like a full-on attack on the whole idea of racial superiority.
Exactly, like questioning why one race would even think they're better than another.
Yeah, and calling out white supremacy as stupid and illogical.
Strong words.
Definitely. And what's really interesting is they connect this to their faith, saying racism just doesn't fit with being a Christian.
Yeah, like true Christianity should be about love and unity for everyone, no matter their race.
Right. And the solution they offer is pretty simple. Love each other always.
Straightforward, but powerful.
Definitely gets to the heart of the issue.
Now, shifting gears completely, we have someone talking about the education system and how even after going to what they considered a good school, they felt like they were missing some pretty basic knowledge.
Yeah, especially about American history and wars.
Yeah, and they contrast this with the expectations for immigrants becoming citizens who have to know all these details, like what's in the Bill of Rights.
Right. It's interesting, right? We expect newcomers to know all this stuff.
Like the Bill of Rights, naming all the presidents, state capitals.
But then are we really giving that same depth of knowledge to students born here?
Good point.
It really makes you think about what the purpose of education is. Is it just about being familiar with a bunch of things, or is it about really deeply understanding things?
And this person definitely felt like they were missing that deeper understanding, not just about America, but the world in general.
Right. And that's a pretty big gap.
Okay, brace yourselves, because now we're getting into some very strong opinions about Donald Trump.
Yeah, the language here is intense.
No kidding. They call him an idiot, an embarrassment, racist, bigot, hypocrite, and a pervert.
Well, yeah, they really don't hold back.
And it's not just name-calling. They bring up specific things, like his comments about women.
Yeah, like the grab them by the PY comment and
Yeah.
the way he treated female reporters.
And also his administration's handling of the pandemic.
Right, they even cite the number of cases and deaths at that time.
Like 6.9 million cases and over 201,000 deaths.
It's important to remember, though, this is just one very strong perspective from your sources.
Exactly. It's a personal opinion based on specific criticisms.
Yeah, and they even predict who they think will vote for him.
They say it'll be red states, people in complete denial, or just absolute idiots.
So clearly, they feel pretty strongly about it.
Okay, let's switch to a totally different topic, one that could impact the entire planet. Environmental destruction.
Yeah, this source really emphasizes the long-term consequences that could be irreversible.
Like the fact that we're using up resources and damaging our habitat.
And they even mention some experts predicting human extinction within a century.
Wow, that's a heavy thought.
It is. And they also highlight how unique Earth is, as a planet that can support life.
Yeah, it puts things in perspective when you think about it that way.
For sure, comparing environmental destruction to something like school bullying
Yeah.
really shows the difference in scale.
Right. One is a problem for a community, the other is a problem for all of humanity.
Yeah.
Another issue that comes up is bullying. And this source tries to look beyond just the behavior itself and understand why bullies do what they do.
Yeah, they admit it's hard to really get it unless you've experienced it firsthand.
But they offer this theory that maybe bullies come from troubled homes and use physical aggression because they feel inadequate inside.
Interesting.
And they also suggest that maybe bullies are actually longing to be understood themselves.
Uh-huh. That's a new way to look at it.
Yeah, it's like trying to find a human explanation even though the behavior is harmful.
Right. Because maybe understanding the root of the problem can help us find better solutions.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of problems, another one that comes up is corruption.
Yeah, and this source points out that while a lot of Americans know about corruption in a general way, they might not really understand how much it costs us.
Or how it affects their daily lives.
Right, and they mentioned this book called Choices, which tries to explain those costs and how they limit our choices.
It's like making the idea of corruption more concrete and relatable,
And then they throw out this stat about the U.S. being ranked second in the world for ignorance.
which is pretty alarming. But they don't actually say what that ranking is based on.
Yeah.
Huh.
So it's hard to know what to make of it, but it definitely raises concerns about how much people really understand about these important issues.
For sure.
Okay, now let's talk about the media, because there's a lot of talk about biased media in your sources.
Yeah. And the argument is that the media twists information and portrays people like Donald Trump worse than they really are.
Right. And this is a big debate these days about whether the media is objective or not.
Yeah. And this source goes even further, claiming that the media is controlled by foreigners.
But they don't actually provide any evidence for that claim.
So it's important for you listening to know that this is an unverified claim.
Right.
And they connect this perceived bias to the spread of hatred and even shootings, especially when you add drugs and guns into the mix.
It's a pretty bold statement.
Definitely.
Now, another interesting perspective that comes up is this idea that America lacks respect for the rest of the world.
Yeah, and they argue that even though we're more globally connected than ever, this lack of respect gets in the way of building positive relationships with other countries.
And they talk about how bias and hate can be passed down through generations.
Like a bad inheritance almost.
Whoa. And they share this personal story about visiting an orphanage in Africa and how the kids there showed so much more love than they were used to.
It's a powerful anecdote,
And then they bring up these images from history, like lynch mobs.
which are really disturbing reminders of how people have been treated in the past.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if all our technological advancements have actually made us any better at treating each other.
It's a good question.
Now let's get into a topic that's always up for debate: drug abuse.
Yeah, and they start by acknowledging the problems caused by legal drugs like cigarettes and alcohol.
Right, because those are definitely issues too.
For sure. And then they get into the whole debate about legalizing drugs that are currently illegal.
And they use prohibition as an example of how making something illegal can actually backfire and create more problems.
Yeah, it's a complicated issue.
And they specifically talk about marijuana and the arguments for legalization, like medical use and personal freedom.
But they also acknowledge the concerns about gang violence and stuff.
Yeah, so it's a multifaceted issue for sure.
Definitely.
Okay, another big problem that comes up is obesity, and this source connects it to the prevalence of junk food and a lack of focus on healthy living.
And the main concern is the long-term impact on people's health, like higher rates of illness and dying younger.
Yeah, they basically argue that the country is prioritizing fast food profits over the well-being of its citizens.
Which is a pretty harsh accusation.
It is, and then there's this whole discussion about fat shaming.
Yeah, and they say that while it's important to accept different body types, obesity is still a health risk that needs to be addressed.
So it's like walking a fine line between body positivity and recognizing the real health consequences.
Right.
Now, another problem that's come up more recently is this idea of political obsession.
And they link this to the way the media controls the news.
Yeah, they say that the constant focus on extreme and sensationalized stories can create a warped view of the world.
Like it makes people more afraid and less able to think clearly.
And that can lead to inaction and distract us from other important things.
It's like being stuck in a constant state of anxiety.
Yeah,
And it makes you wonder if this focus on negativity is really helping anyone.
good point.
Okay, now for a different perspective, because one of your sources suggests that maybe the biggest problem isn't that America is flawed, but that there's not enough patriotism.
Interesting.
Yeah, they focus on the positive things about the U.S., like our freedoms and diversity.
But they also admit that our diversity can also be a source of division.
Right.
So their call to action is for everyone to come together and work towards common goals.
To put aside their differences and be proud of their country.
Yeah, it's a strong emphasis on national unity.
It is.
And this ties into another problem that's briefly mentioned: partisanship.
Right, which is all about the division between political parties.
Yeah.
And even though they don't go into detail, it's clear that they see this division as contributing to a lot of other problems.
Okay, another issue that's raised is America's involvement in foreign wars.
Yeah, and the feeling is that a lot of Americans don't really care about these wars and would rather see resources spent here at home.
Right, and they talk about the economic damage that war causes.
They do make a distinction, though, acknowledging that some interventions, like in the world wars, were seen as necessary.
Right, but others, like some of the conflicts in the Middle East, are more controversial.
Yeah, and this really gets to the heart of the debate about America's role in the world. you know?
Like, how much should we be involved in other countries' affairs versus focusing on our own problems?
It's a tough question.
It is.
Okay, now onto a really tough topic. School shootings.
Yeah, and this source talks about how we've almost become numb to these tragedies.
Like, they've become so common that we're desensitized to the horror of it.
And they try to connect school shootings to a bunch of other issues like bullying, depression, mental health care.
Drugs, alcohol, domestic violence.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to understand the root causes of this violence.
And they mentioned this shocking statistic that it's more likely to die in a school shooting than in the military.
Which is a really scary thought.
It is. But it's important to note that they don't actually provide a source for that claim.
Right, so we can't verify its accuracy.
And of course, the discussion also touches on the Second Amendment and the influence of the NRA.
Which are both huge factors in this debate.
Definitely.
Okay, another big concern that comes up is income inequality.
Specifically, the gap between blue-collar workers and shareholders.
Right, and the source expresses this feeling of hopelessness about it.
Like, it's so obvious, but also feels impossible to fix.
Yeah, and that feeling of powerlessness is a big part of the problem.
For sure.
Now we get a really interesting perspective on disrespect for elders, and it comes from a 16-year-old who admits to doing it themselves.
Wow, that's pretty self-aware.
Yeah, and they argue that older generations have so much knowledge and experience that we should be respecting.
Right, and they compare American culture to some Asian cultures where respecting elders is a big part of their values.
Yeah, and they even suggest that trying to treat everyone equally might actually lead to respecting no one.
It's a thought-provoking idea.
It is, and they don't hold back on their generation either, calling millennials and Gen Z the most disrespectful ever.
Ouch.
Yeah, they see them as entitled and hypocritical.
So clearly there's some tension there.
Definitely.
Okay, terrorism is another issue that comes up, and they define it pretty broadly.
Yeah, not just international groups, but also domestic acts of violence like school shootings and racially motivated attacks.
Right, it's like they're saying that terrorism can come from anywhere.
And they also point out the danger of associating individuals with entire groups based on just a few connections.
Which can lead to discrimination and prejudice,
Yeah,
and ultimately they call for unity.
like the kind of unity that helped America win the revolution.
Exactly. It's like a call to action to make the country better.
Now let's talk about global warming, because this source is really passionate about it.
Yeah, they see it as a huge threat to the planet and to humanity.
And they're frustrated that it's not taken more seriously in America.
Right. They point out that in many other countries, it's considered a fact, not a belief.
Yeah, and they challenge anyone who doubts it to become a scientist and prove it wrong.
Which is a pretty bold challenge.
It is, and they also emphasize that we don't have another planet to go to, so we need to take care of this one.
And they paint this picture of a future where we might need gas masks and have to pay for clean air.
Which sounds pretty dystopian.
Definitely. And they argue that we need to change our mindset and stop prioritizing profit over the planet.
Yeah, and they advocate for a vegan lifestyle as a way to help.
It's clear that they see this as a really urgent issue.
Okay, moving on to a topic that can be pretty controversial. Alt-right and SJW extremism.
Yeah, and they're critical of both.
When it comes to SJWs, they express concern about what they see as a demand for everyone to think the same way.
Like, they can't tolerate any dissenting opinions.
Right, and they call it a divisive ideology that wants to control people's thoughts and feelings.
It's a pretty harsh critique.
It is.
Okay, another issue that comes up is America's obsession with guns.
And they link this to what they call our warring society,
And they express concern about the education level of some gun owners.
specifically police officers.
Yeah, they point out that a lot of police officers only have a high school diploma.
And they cite a statistic about officers with bachelor's degrees using violence less often.
So they suggest that maybe a bachelor's degree should be required for police officers.
Interesting idea.
It is.
Okay, now we have a woman who shares her perspective on feminism.
And she believes that it's misguided.
Yeah, she thinks that feminists complain too much instead of focusing on solutions.
And she argues that women in America already have more privileges than men.
Yeah, she brings up things like false rape accusations and the way assault cases are handled.
And she emphasizes the need for due process and evidence before anyone is imprisoned.
It's a perspective that challenges some common feminist talking points.
It does.
Another problem that comes up is violence in general and how it creates fear and unease in communities.
Yeah, and they share a personal story about their brother who was violent.
And they suggest a possible link between video games and desensitization to violence.
Which is a debate that's been going on for a while.
For sure.
Okay, and then there's the issue of national debt.
Yeah, they're specifically worried about how much money the U.S. owes to China.
Right. And they use Sri Lanka as an example of a country that lost land to China because of debt,
They even claim that the U.S. is technically bankrupt.
which is a pretty scary thought.
It is.
Now, there's also a very brief but strong-worded opinion about Joe Biden.
Yeah, they basically say he's the definition of corruption.
But they don't provide any specific evidence to support that claim.
So it's important to take that statement with a grain of salt.
Right.
And finally, there's a discussion about homophobia.
And they make a distinction between being against homophobia, which they say is respectable, and being toxic about it.
Yeah, so it's like there's a right way and a wrong way to advocate for LGBTQ plus rights.
Exactly.
Wow, so that was a lot. We covered a huge range of issues.
It is.
From personal experiences to global problems.
And we saw a lot of different and sometimes conflicting perspectives.
Yeah, and that was really the goal of this deep dive, to give you a sense of the breadth and complexity of these issues.
Right. It's like a snapshot of all the things that people are thinking and talking about.
So now we want to leave you with a question to ponder. After hearing all these different perspectives, what common threads do you see?
Yeah. What are the underlying themes that connect these seemingly disparate problems?
And maybe even more importantly, is there some unexpected area where a positive change could have a ripple effect and address multiple problems at once?
It's a lot to think about, but we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.
We did our best to present all these complex ideas in a way that's clear and engaging.
And hopefully it will spark some interesting conversations and maybe even some solutions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, and keep those conversations going.